Just one question from Sonny Hostin, and Nicolas Cage's expression said everything on The View. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, one that neither the hosts nor the audience fully see coming in the moment? It begins like any other segment, measured, polite, and carefully paced, but slowly shifts into something more serious as differing perspectives begin to surface. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment opens in a familiar way, with the panel seated around the table, transitioning smoothly from the previous topic into the introduction of the guest. There is a light, welcoming tone as the hosts introduce Nicolas Cage, acknowledging his long career, recent projects, and his reputation for being thoughtful and, at times, unpredictable in interviews. The audience responds with warm applause as he walks out, greeting each host with a handshake and taking his seat. The early part of the conversation follows a comfortable rhythm. The hosts begin with general questions about his recent work, his approach to acting, and how he selects roles at this stage in his career. Nicolas Cage answers in a calm, measured way, offering thoughtful responses that reflect both experience and a certain level of introspection. His tone is steady, and he appears relaxed, occasionally smiling as the audience reacts to some of his lighter remarks. Sonny Hostin leans into the conversation with a question that initially feels aligned with the tone of the segment. She asks about how public perception has shaped his career over time, particularly during periods when his work received mixed reactions. Her delivery is professional and composed, and at first, the question seems like a natural progression from the earlier discussion. Cage responds by acknowledging that public perception is something every actor has to navigate, especially over a long career. He speaks about resilience and the importance of continuing to work despite criticism. His answer is thoughtful but slightly more deliberate than his earlier responses, suggesting that the topic carries more weight for him. As the conversation continues, Sonny follows up with a more pointed observation. She references how some critics have described his acting style as unconventional, and she asks whether he believes that has ever worked against him in maintaining consistency in his career. The question is framed carefully, but there is a noticeable shift in tone. The studio audience becomes quieter, sensing a more serious direction. Cage pauses briefly before answering. His body language changes slightly. He sits a bit more upright, his expression becoming more focused. He responds by saying that what some view as unconventional, he considers intentional. He explains that his approach to acting has always been rooted in creative risk-taking, and that consistency, in his view, doesn't necessarily mean repetition. His voice remains calm, but there is a firmness in how he articulates his perspective. At this point, another host briefly interjects with a supportive comment, noting that many actors are now praised for taking similar risks. The moment softens slightly, and there is a small ripple of applause from the audience. However, Sonny returns to the topic, clarifying her question. She emphasizes that her point is not about creativity itself, but about how audiences connect with performances that may not align with traditional expectations. This is where the conversation begins to take a more noticeable turn. Cage listens carefully, maintaining eye contact, but his response becomes more direct. He explains that audience connection is subjective and that trying to fit into a narrow definition of what is expected can limit artistic expression. He adds that he has always prioritized authenticity in his performances, even if that means not everyone will respond the same way. The exchange remains respectful, but there is now a clear tension in the pacing. The pauses between responses are slightly longer, and the tone has shifted from casual conversation to a more thoughtful and at times firm discussion. The audience remains attentive, with fewer spontaneous reactions, indicating that they are closely following the exchange. Sonny responds by acknowledging his perspective, but brings up the idea of responsibility to audiences, particularly in high-profile roles. She suggests that when actors take on certain projects, there is an expectation to meet a level of relatability or consistency that audiences have come to anticipate. Her tone is still composed, but there is a subtle insistence in how she frames the point. Cage leans slightly forward as he responds, signaling increased engagement. He says that while he respects audience expectations, he does not believe they should dictate creative choices entirely. He explains that part of storytelling is challenging perspectives and offering something different, even if it takes time for audiences to fully appreciate it. His voice remains even, but the firmness in his delivery is now more noticeable. Another host attempts to balance the conversation by asking Cage to reflect on moments when taking creative risks paid off. This briefly shifts the tone back toward a more neutral space. Cage shares an example, describing a role that initially received mixed reactions, but was later recognized more positively over time. The audience responds with light applause, and for a moment, the atmosphere feels less tense. However, Sunny re-enters the discussion with a follow-up that brings the focus back to the core disagreement. She asks whether there have been moments when he reconsidered his approach after receiving strong criticism. The question is not confrontational in delivery, but it is direct, and it brings the conversation back to a more serious tone. Cage takes a brief pause before answering. He acknowledges that criticism is part of the profession, but he emphasizes that he does not make decisions based solely on external reactions. He explains that while he listens to feedback, he ultimately relies on his own judgment and instincts. His response is calm but clearly defined, signaling that this is a point he feels strongly about. At this stage, the dynamic between the two becomes more apparent. Sunny maintains her role as a host asking probing questions, while Cage remains composed but increasingly firm in his responses. The conversation is still respectful, but there is a clear difference in perspective that is not being fully resolved. The audience remains engaged, with occasional murmurs and subtle reactions that reflect the shifting tone. The other hosts appear attentive, occasionally nodding or offering brief interjections, but largely allowing the exchange to unfold. As the segment continues, the pacing slows slightly, with each response carrying more weight. The initial lightness of the conversation has given way to a more thoughtful and, at times, tense discussion about creativity, criticism, and audience expectations. While there is no overt conflict, the difference in viewpoints is now clearly established, setting the stage for how the conversation will continue to develop. As the conversation continues, the shift in tone becomes more noticeable to anyone watching closely. What began as a routine promotional appearance has now settled into a more deliberate exchange, where each question and response carries a bit more weight than before. The panel remains composed, but the rhythm is no longer casual. There is a clear sense that both Nicolas Cage and Sunny Hostin are carefully choosing their words, aware that the discussion has moved into more nuanced territory. Sunny leans slightly forward again, maintaining steady eye contact as she continues her line of questioning. Her tone remains professional, but there is a subtle persistence in how she frames her next point. She acknowledges what Cage has said about artistic independence, but then raises the idea that public figures, particularly actors with long-standing careers, often operate within a relationship with their audience that involves a degree of mutual expectation. It's not presented as a criticism, but rather as a broader observation about the entertainment industry. Cage listens without interrupting, his posture still upright, his expression attentive but serious. When he responds, he does so with a measured pace, explaining that while he understands the concept of audience expectations, he views his role primarily as a storyteller rather than someone obligated to meet a specific set of preferences. He emphasizes that storytelling, in his view, requires freedom. Freedom to experiment, to take risks, and sometimes to step outside what is comfortable or familiar. There is a brief pause after his response, and the audience remains quiet, as if waiting to see how the panel will proceed. One of the other hosts offers a small nod and adds that many viewers appreciate when actors challenge norms, suggesting that it can lead to more memorable performances. This comment briefly eases the tension, and a few members of the audience respond with light applause. Sunny acknowledges that point but gently redirects the conversation. She brings up the idea of accessibility in performances, how certain styles or choices might resonate differently across audiences. Her tone remains calm, but the question is clearly intended to explore the balance between creative expression and audience connection in a more concrete way. She asks whether Cage ever considers how a broader audience might interpret his choices while he's working on a role. Cage takes a moment before answering, his gaze shifting briefly downward as if considering the question carefully. When he speaks, his voice remains even, but there is a noticeable firmness beneath it. He explains that while he is aware of the audience, he doesn't approach his work with the intention of adjusting it to meet a generalized expectation. Instead, he focuses on what he believes serves the character and the story. He adds that authenticity, even when it is unconventional, often finds its audience over time. The exchange remains respectful, but the difference in perspective is now clearly defined. Sunny nods as he speaks, but her expression suggests she is not entirely persuaded. She responds by noting that there are also practical realities within the industry: studio expectations, box office performance, and the broader impact of audience reception. Her point is delivered thoughtfully, but it introduces another layer to the discussion, one that moves beyond personal philosophy into the realities of the business side of acting. At this point, Cage's response becomes slightly more direct. He acknowledges the realities of the industry, but emphasizes that his personal approach has always been to prioritize the work itself over external pressures. He explains that while commercial success is important, it should not come at the expense of creative integrity. His tone remains controlled, but there is a clear emphasis in how he articulates the phrase creative integrity, signaling that this is a core principle for him. The audience reacts with a mix of quiet attentiveness and occasional nods, reflecting an understanding of the weight of the discussion. There is no disruption, no overt reaction, just a steady focus on the exchange unfolding at the table. Another host steps in at this moment, attempting to broaden the conversation slightly. She asks Cage about how his perspective has evolved over the years, particularly given the changes in the industry and the rise of new platforms and audiences. This question shifts the focus away from the immediate tension and allows Cage to reflect more broadly on his career. Cage responds by speaking about adaptability and how the industry has changed, noting that there are now more opportunities for diverse storytelling than ever before. His tone softens slightly as he discusses this, and the conversation briefly returns to a more reflective and less pointed dynamic. He shares that he has embraced these changes and sees them as an opportunity to continue exploring different types of roles. However, as the discussion moves forward, Sunny returns to a specific point that reconnects with the earlier tension. She references moments in Cage's career where certain performances were met with strong public reactions, both positive and negative, and asks whether those moments ever prompted him to reassess his approach. The question is framed carefully, but it is direct enough to bring the conversation back into a more focused exchange. Cage listens, his expression steady, and then responds with a clear and composed answer. He says that while he is aware of how his work is received, he does not approach his career as something that needs constant adjustment based on external feedback. He explains that consistency, for him, lies in staying true to his process rather than altering it in response to changing opinions. His delivery is calm, but there is a noticeable firmness that underscores his point. The pacing of the conversation slows slightly again, with longer pauses between responses. The audience remains engaged, and the other hosts appear attentive, occasionally glancing between Cage and Sunny as the exchange continues. Sunny acknowledges his response, but then adds another layer to her perspective. She suggests that for some viewers, consistency in performance style can create a sense of reliability, something that helps build a lasting connection with an audience. Her tone remains even, but there is a subtle emphasis on the importance of that connection. Cage responds by clarifying that he does not equate consistency with repetition. He explains that he believes audiences can form strong connections with performances that are varied and unexpected, as long as they are rooted in sincerity. He adds that part of his goal as an actor is to avoid becoming predictable, even if that means taking risks that might not always be immediately understood. At this point, the dynamic between the two feels more defined than before. There is no interruption or overlap in their speech, but the back and forth has a deliberate quality, with each response building on the last. The conversation remains respectful, but the underlying tension is now clearly part of the exchange. The audience's reactions remain subdued, reflecting the seriousness of the discussion. There are occasional nods and quiet murmurs, but no strong applause or laughter. It is the kind of moment where viewers are listening closely, aware that the conversation has moved beyond surface-level topics. One of the hosts briefly attempts to lighten the tone by referencing a well-known role from Cage's past, prompting a small smile from him and a gentle laugh from the audience. For a moment, the atmosphere relaxes, and the conversation feels closer to its original tone. But even in that lighter moment, the earlier discussion lingers in the background. As the segment continues, it is clear that the exchange between Cage and Sunny has set a more thoughtful and serious tone for the remainder of the interview. With both perspectives firmly established and the audience fully engaged in how the conversation will continue to unfold. As the segment moves forward, the atmosphere in the studio settles into a more focused quiet. The earlier lightness hasn't completely disappeared, but it now sits alongside a more deliberate tone. Viewers watching closely can sense that the conversation has reached a point where both Nicolas Cage and Sunny Hostin are no longer just exchanging general ideas. They are now responding directly to each other's perspectives with greater clarity. One of the co-hosts briefly steps in again, attempting to reframe the discussion in a way that might bridge the gap. She mentions that many actors over time have had to balance artistic individuality with audience expectations, and she asks whether that balance looks different today than it did earlier in Cage's career. It's a question that invites reflection rather than debate, and for a moment, it appears to ease the pacing. Cage responds thoughtfully, acknowledging that the industry has always involved a degree of balance, but he reiterates that his personal approach has remained largely consistent. He explains that while external factors have evolved, technology, distribution, audience reach, his internal process has not changed in a fundamental way. His tone is steady, and he speaks with the kind of measured confidence that suggests he has considered these questions many times before. Sunny listens closely, nodding as he speaks, but as soon as he finishes, she re-enters the conversation with a more specific point. She brings up the idea that when actors consistently choose unconventional roles or performances, it can sometimes create a disconnect for certain segments of the audience. Her delivery remains composed, but there is a quiet insistence in her phrasing, as if she wants to make sure the point is clearly understood. This is where Cage's response becomes more noticeably firm. He leans slightly forward again, his hands coming together briefly before resting on the table. He acknowledges that not every performance will resonate with every viewer, but he challenges the idea that this should be viewed as a drawback. Instead, he frames it as part of the artistic process, something that allows for diversity in storytelling and interpretation. There is a brief pause after he finishes, and the audience remains silent, absorbing the exchange. The stillness in the room highlights the shift from casual conversation to something more reflective and, at times, quietly tense. Sunny follows up by clarifying that her point is not about limiting creativity, but about understanding the broader impact of artistic choices. She references how certain performances can shape public perception, not just of a role, but of the actor as a whole. Her tone is calm, but there is a subtle emphasis on the idea of responsibility, how public figures are often viewed through the lens of their work. Cage listens without interruption, maintaining eye contact. When he responds, his voice remains even, but there is now a sharper clarity in his words. He explains that while he understands how public perception can be influenced, he does not believe that it should dictate creative decisions. He adds that trying to control perception can lead to safer, less authentic work, which, in his view, ultimately does a disservice to storytelling. At this point, one of the other hosts gently interjects, acknowledging both perspectives. She notes that the discussion reflects a larger conversation within the entertainment industry, one that doesn't always have a clear answer. Her comment acts as a brief pause, giving the conversation a moment to reset without fully stepping away from the topic. The audience responds with light applause, appreciating the attempt to balance the exchange. For a few seconds, the tension eases slightly, and the conversation feels less pointed. But Sunny returns once more, this time with a slightly different angle. She asks whether Cage believes there is ever a moment when an actor should adjust their approach, not necessarily to conform, but to evolve in response to changing audiences. The question is framed carefully, and her tone remains steady, but it once again brings the discussion back to a central point of difference. Cage takes a longer pause before answering this time. He looks down briefly, then back up, as if choosing his words with extra care. When he speaks, his tone is calm but unmistakably firm. He explains that evolution, in his view, comes from within, from personal growth, new experiences, and creative exploration, not from external pressure to change. He emphasizes that while he is always learning and adapting, those changes are driven by his own instincts rather than by audience expectations. The way he delivers this response signals a clear boundary in the conversation. It's not confrontational, but it is definitive. The audience remains quiet, with a few subtle nods visible among those seated closer to the stage. Sunny acknowledges his answer with a slight nod, but her expression suggests she is still considering his perspective critically. She responds by saying that for many viewers, the relationship with actors is built over time, and that consistency, however it is defined, can play a role in maintaining that connection. Her tone is thoughtful, not challenging, but it reinforces the contrast in viewpoints. At this stage, the back and forth has taken on a steady rhythm. There are no interruptions, no raised voices, but the exchange carries a quiet intensity. Each response is measured, each point clearly articulated, and neither side appears to be shifting significantly from their position. One of the co-hosts steps in again, attempting to bring the conversation back toward a more general discussion. She asks Cage about how he prepares for roles that require particularly unconventional approaches, steering the focus back to his craft rather than the broader debate. It's a noticeable pivot, and it provides a brief opportunity for the tone to soften. Cage responds with a more detailed explanation of his process, discussing research, emotional preparation, and the importance of understanding a character's perspective. As he speaks, his posture relaxes slightly, and the intensity of the previous exchange begins to ease. The audience listens attentively, and a few nods and quiet reactions suggest renewed engagement with the topic. However, even as the conversation shifts, the earlier discussion continues to influence the tone. When Sunny responds to his explanation, she ties it back, gently but clearly, to the broader question of how those creative choices are received by audiences. Her ability to connect the discussion back to the original point keeps the tension present, even as the surface-level topic appears to change. Cage acknowledges her comment, but chooses to keep his response focused on his process rather than revisiting the earlier debate directly. His tone remains calm, but there is a subtle sense that he is steering the conversation toward a space where he feels more comfortable, one centered on his work rather than on external interpretation. The audience seems to pick up on this shift. There is a slight increase in audible reactions, small murmurs, a brief moment of applause, indicating that the conversation feels more familiar again, even if the underlying tension has not fully disappeared. As the segment continues, the hosts appear more mindful of pacing. The questions become slightly broader, the responses a bit less pointed. But the exchange between Cage and Sunny has already left its mark, shaping how the rest of the conversation unfolds. What remains is a careful balance, a return to the format of a daytime talk show, paired with the lingering sense of a meaningful disagreement that, while handled respectfully, has added a layer of depth to what might otherwise have been a routine interview. As the conversation moves deeper into the segment, there is a noticeable effort from the panel to maintain a steady, balanced tone. The earlier exchange has not been forgotten, but it has settled into the background, influencing the way each new question is asked and answered. The pacing becomes slightly more measured, as if everyone at the table is aware of the need to keep the discussion constructive while still allowing space for differing perspectives. One of the co-hosts transitions the conversation toward Cage's recent projects again, bringing the focus back to his work in a more direct way. She asks about a particular role that required a strong emotional range, inviting him to elaborate on how he approached it. The question feels familiar and grounded, and for a moment, the atmosphere in the studio lightens. Cage responds with a detailed explanation, speaking about the preparation involved and how he connects with characters on a personal level. His tone softens compared to earlier moments, and there is a sense of ease as he describes the creative process. The audience reacts with quiet interest, and a few appreciative nods can be seen among those seated near the front. As he continues, he emphasizes the importance of staying open to different interpretations, both from within himself and from the audience. This point, while connected to his craft, subtly echoes the earlier discussion without directly revisiting it. It's a careful way of reinforcing his perspective without reintroducing tension too directly. Sunny listens attentively, and when she speaks again, her tone is slightly more reflective than before. She acknowledges the depth of his explanation and agrees that emotional authenticity plays a significant role in performance. However, she gently brings the conversation back to the audience's experience, noting that different viewers can interpret the same performance in very different ways. This time, her delivery feels less pointed and more exploratory. It's as though the earlier back and forth has shifted her approach, leading to a more conversational tone rather than a probing one. The change is subtle but noticeable, and it helps maintain a sense of balance in the discussion. Cage responds in kind, agreeing that interpretation varies and that this diversity of perspective is part of what makes storytelling meaningful. His tone remains calm and composed, and there is a slight nod as he speaks, signaling a moment of alignment, even if it is only partial. The audience reacts positively to this exchange, with a brief round of light applause. It's the kind of reaction that suggests relief as much as appreciation, a recognition that the conversation has found a more comfortable rhythm again. Another host takes the opportunity to ask a lighter question, referencing a memorable moment from one of Cage's past performances that resonated widely with audiences. The question prompts a small smile from him, and he responds with a brief anecdote that draws a gentle laugh from the crowd. The atmosphere in the studio becomes noticeably warmer, and for a few moments, the tension that defined earlier parts of the segment feels distant. Even so, the structure of the conversation continues to reflect what has already taken place. The hosts allow Cage more space to speak without interruption, and when they do interject, their comments are more affirming than challenging. It's a natural adjustment that often happens in live television after a more intense exchange, an unspoken effort to keep the segment flowing smoothly. Sunny re-enters the discussion once more, but this time her approach is clearly more measured. She frames her next question around how actors navigate long careers in an industry that is constantly evolving. Rather than focusing on criticism or audience expectations directly, she broadens the scope, asking about longevity and adaptability. Cage responds thoughtfully, speaking about the importance of staying engaged with the craft and being willing to explore new opportunities. He reiterates that while the industry changes, the core of his approach remains the same. His tone is steady, and there is a sense that he is comfortable returning to this broader perspective. As he speaks, his body language reflects a more relaxed state. His shoulders ease slightly, and his gestures become more natural. The earlier firmness is still present, but it is no longer at the forefront of his delivery. Sunny nods as he answers, and this time, she does not immediately follow up with a counterpoint. Instead, she allows a brief pause, giving space for the moment to settle. It's a small but meaningful shift, indicating a mutual understanding of the conversation's earlier intensity. One of the co-hosts then brings in a question about how audiences have responded to Cage's more recent work, particularly in the context of changing viewing habits and platforms. The question is framed in a way that invites reflection without introducing tension, and it allows Cage to speak about audience engagement in a more general sense. He responds by acknowledging that audiences today have more access to content than ever before, which creates both opportunities and challenges for actors. He speaks about the importance of staying relevant while also remaining true to one's creative instincts. The balance he describes echoes earlier themes, but is presented in a way that feels less like a debate and more like a shared observation. The audience listens attentively, with occasional nods and a few quiet murmurs of agreement. The overall energy in the room feels steady and composed, reflecting a segment that has moved through tension and found its way back to a more familiar rhythm. As the conversation begins to approach its final moments, the hosts appear more focused on wrapping up in a way that feels cohesive. Their questions become slightly shorter, their tone more conclusive. There is an unspoken understanding that the segment needs to end on a note that reflects both the depth of the discussion and the tone of the show. Sunny offers one final comment rather than a question, acknowledging that conversations like this are important because they highlight different perspectives within the industry. Her tone is calm and measured, and there is no sense of challenge in her words, only a recognition of the exchange that has taken place. Cage responds with a brief nod and a simple acknowledgement, expressing appreciation for the discussion. His tone is even, and there is a sense of closure in how he delivers the response. The audience reacts with a warm round of applause, signaling an appreciation not just for his presence on the show, but for the conversation as a whole. The earlier tension has not been erased, but it has been absorbed into a broader, more balanced exchange. As the segment transitions toward its conclusion, the camera briefly captures the panel sharing small smiles and nods, a visual indication that, despite the differences in perspective, the conversation has remained respectful and grounded, exactly the kind of exchange that defines live daytime television at its most engaging. As the segment enters its final moments, there is a noticeable shift in pacing that signals the conversation is coming to a close. The hosts begin to wrap their thoughts in a more concise way, while still maintaining the composed and respectful tone that has defined the latter part of the discussion. The earlier tension hasn't disappeared, but it has settled into something more reflective, an exchange that feels complete rather than unresolved. One of the co-hosts offers a brief closing question, asking Nicolas Cage what continues to motivate him after so many years in the industry. It's a familiar kind of closing prompt, one designed to leave the audience with a clear and personal takeaway. Cage answers in a calm and thoughtful manner, explaining that his motivation comes from a continued curiosity about storytelling and a desire to keep exploring new creative challenges. His voice is steady, and there is a sense of sincerity in how he speaks, which resonates with the audience. As he finishes, the audience responds with a warm and sustained round of applause. It's not overly loud or exaggerated, but it carries a sense of appreciation, both for his presence on the show and for the conversation that has unfolded. The camera briefly cuts to the hosts, who are nodding and smiling, acknowledging the moment. Sunny Hostin offers a final comment, thanking Cage for being open to the discussion. Her tone is composed and professional, and while it reflects the earlier exchange, it does so in a way that emphasizes respect rather than disagreement. Cage responds with a polite thank you, and there is a brief moment of eye contact between the two that suggests a mutual understanding, even if their perspectives did not fully align. The segment then transitions in the way daytime talk shows typically do. The hosts shift their posture slightly, the energy lightens, and one of them begins to introduce the next part of the program. As the camera pulls back, the audience applause continues for a few seconds before gradually fading, and the show moves forward. However, as is often the case with moments like this, the conversation doesn't end when the segment does. For viewers watching at home, the exchange leaves a lasting impression, not because of any dramatic confrontation, but because of the clear and thoughtful difference in viewpoints that was expressed on live television. Shortly after the episode airs, clips of the conversation begin to circulate online. Viewers share segments of the exchange, particularly the moments where Cage responded most firmly to Sunny's questions. The reactions are varied. Some viewers express support for Cage's emphasis on creative independence, appreciating his willingness to articulate his perspective without becoming confrontational. Others side with Sunny's viewpoint, noting that her questions reflected a broader audience perspective and raised valid points about the relationship between performers and viewers. On social media, the discussion becomes more layered. Some users highlight how respectful the exchange remained, pointing out that both individuals maintained a professional tone throughout. Others focus on specific moments, pauses, phrasing, body language, analyzing how the conversation evolved over time. There are also viewers who appreciate the segment simply for being more substantive than a typical promotional interview, noting that it offered a deeper look into the realities of the entertainment industry. In follow-up discussions, entertainment commentators reference the segment as an example of how live television can create space for meaningful dialogue, even within the structure of a daytime talk show. The fact that the conversation remained calm and measured, despite moments of tension, is often noted as a key reason it resonated with viewers. There are also clarifications that emerge in the hours and days after the broadcast. Some viewers initially interpret parts of the exchange as more confrontational than they were, but others who watch the full segment point out that the tone remained consistent with the norms of daytime television. The context of the entire conversation becomes important, as it shows how the discussion developed gradually rather than escalating suddenly. Neither Cage nor Sunny makes any immediate public statement about the exchange, which further reinforces the sense that, from their perspective, it was a professional and appropriate conversation. This absence of follow-up commentary allows the segment to stand on its own, leaving viewers to interpret it based on what they saw. Within the show itself, the moment is not revisited in a dramatic way. If it is mentioned at all in later episodes, it is done briefly and in a neutral tone, consistent with how the program typically handles segments that generate attention. The focus remains on moving forward rather than revisiting past discussions. For many viewers, what stands out most is not a single line or moment, but the overall progression of the conversation. It begins as a routine interview, shifts into a more serious exchange of ideas, and then returns to a balanced and respectful conclusion. That arc, subtle but clear, is what gives the segment its impact. The audience in the studio, too, plays a role in shaping how the moment is remembered. Their reactions, quiet attentiveness during the more serious points, light applause during moments of agreement, and warm appreciation at the end, reflect the tone of the conversation as it unfolded in real time. It's a reminder that live television is as much about the audience's experience as it is about what is said at the table. As the clip continues to circulate, some viewers revisit it multiple times, noticing details they may have missed initially. The pacing, the pauses, the way each participant listens before responding. All of these elements contribute to the overall impression of a conversation that, while not without tension, remains grounded and constructive. In the end, the segment becomes a small but notable example of how differing perspectives can be expressed on live television without losing a sense of respect or professionalism. It doesn't rely on dramatic confrontation or exaggerated reactions. Instead, it holds attention through the clarity of its discussion and the authenticity of its tone. And for viewers who come across the clip later, perhaps without having seen the full episode, it serves as a reminder that even routine talk show segments can take unexpected turns, sometimes leading to conversations that stay with the audience long after the show has moved on. If you watch this moment, or if you're seeing it for the first time now, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.